Welcome to this gentle exploration of one of neuroscience's most profound mysteries. Tonight, we drift into the quiet depths of your own mind, where a bridge of extraordinary delicacy carries whispers between two worlds that you never knew existed. Picture, if you will, a structure so thin it could barely hold a feather, yet so vital that it defines the very essence of who you are. Deep within the folds of your brain, suspended like morning mist, between two great continents of thought, lies the corpus callosum, a bridge made not of steel or stone, but of 200 million neural threads, each finer than a spider's silk, each carrying messages more precious than any treasure. This is your silent bridge, and right now, as you listen to these words, it hums with the constant murmur of communication. Every thought you think, every emotion you feel, every decision you make, all depend on this gossamer highway that allows your left hemisphere to whisper to your right, and your right to respond in its own eloquent way. The corpus callosum is, in many ways, like a vast neural internet, connecting two cities of the mind that are simultaneously foreign to each other and intimately intertwined. These neural fibers, arranged with the precision of a master weaver, carry electrical signals at speeds that would make lightning seem leisurely. In the time it takes you to blink, millions of messages have crossed this bridge, coordinating the symphony of your consciousness. It is both humbling and beautiful that this structure, no thicker than a few sheets of paper, orchestrates the seamless dance of your awareness. Without it, the simple act of reaching for a glass of water with your right hand, while your left eye watches the movement, would become a complex negotiation between two minds that can barely comprehend each other's existence. Scientists have learned that this bridge develops slowly, like a fine wine aging in darkness. In infancy, our two hemispheres begin as separate islands of potential, gradually building connections across the neural divide. The corpus callosum doesn't fully mature until we reach our 20s, which means that for the first decades of our lives, we are slowly learning to become truly integrated beings. Yet this elegant architecture raises a profound question that has enchanted philosophers and neuroscientists for generations. If our consciousness depends on this bridge of whispers, what happens when the bridge falls silent? What becomes of the mind when these two neural continents can no longer speak to each other? The answer, as we shall discover, reveals something both deeply unsettling and strangely beautiful about the nature of human consciousness itself. As we begin this journey together, let yourself imagine the gentle electrical storms playing across your corpus callosum right now, each spark a word in a conversation between two aspects of yourself that you've never consciously met. For an understanding what happens when this conversation ends, we come to appreciate the miracle of its existence, and perhaps the mysterious plurality that may already exist within the unity you call yourself. In the quiet depths of our everyday experience, we carry with us a profound assumption, one so fundamental that we rarely pause to question its truth. We assume, without hesitation, that we are one person, living in one mind, experiencing one stream of consciousness that flows as smoothly as a river toward the sea. But what if this certainty is nothing more than a beautifully orchestrated illusion? What if the unified sense of I that narrates your inner world is actually the collaborative performance of two separate actors, so perfectly synchronized that they create the seamless impression of a single voice. Tonight, we drift into the theater of consciousness, where the stage lights illuminate a truth both wondrous and unsettling. Your mind may be less like a solo performance and more like an exquisite duet, two voices harmonizing so perfectly that even you, the audience of your own experience, cannot distinguish where one ends and the other begins. Consider, for a moment, the remarkable fact that your brain is divided down its very center, split into two hemispheres that mirror each other like reflection in still water. Each side possesses its own networks of neurons, its own patterns of activation, its own way of processing the endless stream of information that flows through your senses. Yet somehow, these two neural worlds collaborate to create what feels like a singular, unified experience of being you. This collaboration happens through that bridge of whispers we explored earlier, the corpus callosum. Every moment of your waking life, these 200 million neural fibers carry a constant dialogue between your hemispheres, a conversation so rapid and sophisticated that it creates the illusion of mental unity. Your left hemisphere might notice the logical structure of a problem, while your right hemisphere grasps its emotional significance. And before you're even aware of thinking, they've shared their insights and arrived at what feels like a single, integrated understanding. The beauty of this system lies in its invisibility. Like the musicians in a perfectly rehearsed orchestra, your two hemispheres play their separate parts so flawlessly that you hear only the symphony, never the individual instruments. Your sense of having one coherent personality, one set of beliefs, one continuous narrative of memory and experience, all of this emerges from the seamless cooperation of two neural systems that are, in many ways, as different as two people. But here lies the profound mystery that has captured the imagination of neuroscientists and philosophers alike. If your unified consciousness depends on this constant neural conversation, what would happen if the conversation suddenly stopped? Would you still be one person, or would you become two? Would your sense of self fragment like light through a prism, revealing the hidden spectrum that was always there? The question touches something deep and unsettling about human nature. We organize our entire understanding of identity, responsibility, and relationships around the assumption that each body contains one mind, one self, one conscious agent making decisions and forming memories. Our legal systems, our moral frameworks, our deepest relationships all rest on this foundation of psychological unity. Yet the more we learn about the brain's divided architecture, the more we begin to wonder whether this unity is as fragile as morning mist. Perhaps consciousness is not the indivisible atom of experience we've always imagined, but rather something more like a temporarily stable coalition of separate processes, a democracy of mind that usually speaks with one voice, but could, under the right circumstances, reveal its true plurality. As we prepare to explore what happens when this coalition dissolves, take a moment to appreciate the extraordinary achievement of your own consciousness right now. Two hemispheres of your brain are reading these words, processing their meaning, generating emotional responses, and weaving it all together into the seamless tapestry of your current experience. The fact that this feels effortless, that you experience yourself as one unified being contemplating these ideas, is perhaps the most magnificent illusion in all of nature. There is something almost musical about the way medical discoveries emerge from the shadows of human suffering, transforming moments of crisis into windows of understanding that illuminate the deepest mysteries of our existence. In the quiet corridors of mid-20th century hospitals, a small group of patients suffering from severe epilepsy became unwitting pioneers in one of neuroscience's most profound journeys, a journey that would forever change how we understand the nature of human consciousness. These were people whose lives had been claimed by electrical storms in their brains, seizures so violent and frequent that no medication could calm them, no treatment could provide relief. Their epilepsy was not just a medical condition, but a kind of neural civil war, with chaotic electrical discharges spreading from one hemisphere to the other across that bridge of whispers we know as the corpus callosum, amplifying and multiplying until their entire brain became a battlefield. For these patients, conventional medicine had reached its limits. But in the 1960s, a small group of pioneering neurosurgeons began to consider a procedure so radical it seemed almost like science fiction. What if they could stop the seizures by cutting the bridge itself? What if they could sever the corpus callosum, creating two isolated islands of consciousness that could no longer amplify each other's electrical chaos? The surgery, known as corpus callosotomy, involved opening the skull and carefully dividing those 200 million neural fibers that had carried whispered conversations between hemispheres since birth. It was like gently dismantling a bridge, while the cities on either side continued their daily life, unaware that their connection to the other world was being severed forever. Picture, if you will, the profound silence that must have fallen across this neural divide as the last fiber was cut. After decades of constant communication, the two halves of these patients' brains were suddenly alone, isolated in a way that no human consciousness had ever experienced. For the first time in their lives, indeed, for perhaps the first time in human evolutionary history, two complete neural systems found themselves occupying the same skull while being unable to share their experiences. The medical results were often miraculous. The seizures stopped or dramatically decreased, giving these patients their lives back. But as they recovered from surgery and began to navigate their daily existence, something remarkable began to emerge, something that would fundamentally challenge our understanding of what it means to have a mind. At first, the changes were subtle, barely noticeable to casual observation. These patients could walk, talk, and carry on conversations that seemed perfectly normal. They retained their memories, their personalities, their ability to reason and feel. To friends and family, they appeared to be the same people they had always been, perhaps just calmer now that the seizures had stopped. But in the careful silence of research laboratories, under the gentle observation of scientists who had learned to look beyond the surface of human behavior, these patients began to reveal something extraordinary. Their minds, it seemed, had not simply healed, they had divided. Where once there had been one unified consciousness, there now appeared to be two separate streams of awareness, two different centers of experience coexisting in the same brain. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be split like this, what did that say about the nature of the self? Were we all, in some sense, multiple beings held together by nothing more than a bridge of neural tissue? And if these patients were now, in some fundamental way, two people rather than one, how should we understand their identity, their responsibility, their very personhood? As we drift deeper into this mystery, we begin to realize that these split-brain patients had become inadvertent explorers of consciousness itself, mapping territories of human experience that no one had ever imagined existed. Their condition would soon reveal secrets about the mind that would challenge our most basic assumptions about who we are and how our inner world is constructed. The bridge had fallen silent, but in that silence, a new kind of music was about to emerge. The strange, haunting symphony of a mind divided against itself. In the gentle aftermath of surgery, as these remarkable patients began to heal and return to the rhythms of daily life, researchers started to notice something that defied all expectations about how a human mind should behave. It began with small anomalies, moments of confusion so subtle they might have been dismissed as temporary effects of major surgery, were it not for the careful attention of scientists who had learned to watch for the impossible. Picture, if you will, a patient reaching for a cup of coffee with their right hand, while their left hand, seemingly with a mind of its own, pushes it away. Or imagine someone getting dressed in the morning, carefully buttoning their shirt with one hand, while the other hand follows behind, systematically unbuttoning what was just fastened. These weren't simple motor problems or lack of coordination. They were the first glimpses of something far more profound and disturbing. What doctors were witnessing was nothing less than a civil war of consciousness, two separate centers of awareness, sharing the same body but operating with different intentions, different desires, sometimes even different beliefs about what should happen next. It was as if the surgery had not just stopped the seizures, but had revealed that what we call a person might actually be a temporary alliance between two distinct minds that normally cooperate so seamlessly we never notice their separateness. The left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, would sometimes appear to act independently of the patient's stated intentions. In one famous case, a patient would reach for one item on a shelf with their right hand, while their left hand would simultaneously reach for something completely different, as if two shoppers with different preferences were trapped in the same body. The patient's verbal, conscious mind, dominated by the left hemisphere, would express surprise and even frustration at these rebellious actions, genuinely puzzled by their own behavior. Even more unsettling were the moments when the two sides seemed to develop different emotional responses to the same situation. A patient might smile with half their face, while the other half remained neutral or even frowning, as if two different people were watching the same movie and having entirely different reactions. The verbal, dominant hemisphere would often try to explain these contradictions, creating elaborate stories to make sense of behaviors that it had not initiated and did not understand. There is something almost heartbreaking about imagining what this must have felt like from the inside. The speaking, dominant consciousness, the part that maintained the patient's sense of verbal identity and continuity with their pre-surgery self, found itself sharing space with a silent presence that had its own agenda, its own responses to the world, its own way of interpreting and reacting to experience. This silent presence, locked away in the right hemisphere and cut off from the brain's language centers, could not explain itself or negotiate with its verbal companion. It could only act through the left side of the body, expressing its thoughts and feelings through gestures and behaviors that often baffled the speaking consciousness that shared its skull. researchers began to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented in human experience: the emergence of two separate streams of consciousness that had once been unified but were now forced to coexist as strangers in the same neural house. Each hemisphere was processing information, forming responses, making decisions, but they could no longer share these processes with each other. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be divided so clearly and completely, what did that say about the nature of the self in people with intact brains? Were we all, in some sense, multiple beings held together by the constant conversation across our corpus callosum? And if so, what happened to concepts of personal responsibility, individual identity, and the unified self that formed the foundation of our understanding of human nature? As we prepare to delve deeper into the scientific discoveries that emerge from studying these remarkable individuals, we begin to appreciate that they had become inadvertent ambassadors from a realm of consciousness that no human had ever explored. In their divided awareness, they carried secrets about the nature of mind that would challenge everything we thought we knew about what it means to be a conscious, unified human being. The house of consciousness, it seemed, had always had two occupants. The surgery had simply made it impossible for them to pretend they were one. In the quiet halls of the California Institute of Technology during the 1960s, a man with gentle eyes and an insatiable curiosity about the mysteries of consciousness was about to change forever how humanity understood its own mind. Roger Sperry moved through his laboratory with the careful precision of someone who knew he was handling something infinitely precious, the very essence of human awareness itself. There is something almost poetic about how scientific revolutions often begin not with grand proclamations, but with simple questions asked by minds willing to challenge what everyone else accepts as obvious truth. For Sperry, that question was deceptively simple. What exactly does each half of the brain contribute to our conscious experience? It was a question that would lead him through a labyrinth of discovery so profound that it would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize and fundamentally alter our understanding of human consciousness. When Sperry first encountered the split brain patients in the early 1960s, he found himself standing at the threshold of an unprecedented opportunity. Here were individuals whose brains had been naturally divided by surgery, creating what was essentially a controlled experiment in consciousness that nature and medicine had conspired to provide. These patients offered a window into the workings of the mind that no scientist had ever imagined possible, but Sperry possessed something that set him apart from other researchers of his time, an almost mystical intuition about the hidden depths of consciousness, combined with the methodical rigor of a master experimentalist. He understood that studying these patients required more than just observing their obvious behaviors. It required designing experiments so elegant and precise that they could reveal the subtle conversations that had once flowed between hemispheres and the equally subtle silences that now defined their divided experience. Picture, if you will, Sperry in his dimly lit laboratory, sitting across from a patient whose brain harbored secrets that neither science nor philosophy had ever contemplated. With infinite patience, he began to design tests that could speak separately to each hemisphere, creating a kind of neural archaeology that would uncover layers of consciousness that had been hidden beneath the surface of unified experience. His breakthrough came when he realized that the key to understanding a split brain Consciousness lay in the architecture of vision itself. Our eyes, he knew, are wired in such a way that the left half of what we see is processed primarily by the right hemisphere, while the right half is handled by the left hemisphere. In people with intact brains, this information is immediately shared across the corpus callosum, creating a unified visual experience. But in split-brain patients, each hemisphere would see its half of the world in isolation, unable to share what it had witnessed with its neural neighbor. This insight led Sperry to develop what would become known as the visual field experiments, tests so simple in concept yet so revolutionary in their implications that they would rewrite the textbooks on human consciousness. By carefully controlling what each hemisphere could see, Sperry could essentially have separate conversations with two different minds that happened to share the same skull. The results of these experiments were nothing short of extraordinary. Sperry discovered that when information was presented only to the right hemisphere, the one that could not speak, patients would deny seeing anything at all, yet their left hand, controlled by that supposedly blind hemisphere, would reach out and accurately select objects that matched what had been shown. It was as if there were two different people in the same body, one who could talk but claimed to see nothing, and another who could see perfectly but had no voice to describe the experience. Even more remarkable was what happened when Sperry presented conflicting information to each hemisphere simultaneously. The left hemisphere might see the word cat, while the right hemisphere saw dog. The patient would confidently say cat, because that was what the verbal, dominant hemisphere had seen, while simultaneously using their left hand to draw a picture of a dog, expressing what the silent hemisphere had witnessed. Through countless hours of careful experimentation, Sperry began to map the unique personalities and capabilities of each hemisphere. The left brain emerged as logical, analytical, and verbal. The hemisphere that maintained our sense of continuous narrative identity and tried to make rational sense of experience. The right brain revealed itself as more spatial, emotional, and artistic, capable of grasping the big picture and the subtle emotional undertones that gave life its deeper meaning. But perhaps Sperry's most profound discovery was that both hemispheres were fully conscious. This wasn't simply a case of one brain doing the thinking, while the other performed mechanical functions. Each hemisphere was processing information, forming opinions, making decisions, and experiencing the world in its own distinct way. The split-brain patients had revealed that consciousness itself could be divided, that what we experience as the unified self might actually be the collaborative creation of two separate minds. As we drift deeper into the implications of Sperry's work, we begin to appreciate that this quiet scientist had not just made a medical discovery, he had uncovered a fundamental truth about human nature that challenged our most basic assumptions about consciousness, identity, and what it means to be a person. His silent revolution would continue to echo through neuroscience, philosophy, and our understanding of ourselves for generations to come. There is something almost magical about the way light carries information across the darkness, delivering messages from the outside world to the secret chambers of our consciousness. In Roger Sperry's laboratory, this everyday miracle of vision became the key to unlocking one of the most profound mysteries in all of neuroscience: how to speak separately to two minds that shared the same skull. The visual field experiments that emerged from Sperry's work represent one of those rare moments in scientific history when elegant simplicity reveals cosmic complexity. The setup was deceptively straightforward. Patients would sit before a screen while a device called a tachistoscope flashed images or words so briefly that they could only be processed by one hemisphere at a time. Yet from this simple arrangement emerged discoveries so startling that they fundamentally changed how we understand consciousness itself. Picture, if you will, a split-brain patient seated in the soft glow of the laboratory, their gaze fixed on a central point, while images dance across their visual field faster than conscious thought. To the left of center, information destined for the right hemisphere. To the right, messages meant for the left brain. For the first time in human history, scientists could conduct separate conversations with two different minds inhabiting the same body. The first results were so extraordinary, they seemed almost impossible to believe. When a word like spoon was flashed to the left visual field, and thus processed by the right hemisphere, something remarkable happened. The patient would claim, with complete sincerity, that they had seen nothing at all. The verbal, dominant left hemisphere, which controlled speech, genuinely had no knowledge of what had been presented. As far as the speaking mind was concerned, the screen had remained blank. But then came the revelation that would change everything. When asked to use their left hand, controlled by that supposedly unaware right hemisphere, to reach into a bag of objects, the patient would immediately and accurately select a spoon. Their hand knew what their mouth denied. Two different types of knowledge existed in the same brain, one that could be spoken and one that could only be acted upon. Even more fascinating were the experiments that revealed the emotional lives of the separated hemispheres. When researchers flashed an image of a nude figure to the right hemisphere of a female patient, something beautiful and mysterious occurred. The woman would begin to laugh and blush, clearly experiencing an emotional response. But when asked why she was laughing, her verbal left hemisphere, which had not seen the image, would create an elaborate explanation. "Oh, that machine is silly. It makes me laugh." The right hemisphere had experienced embarrassment and amusement, but the left hemisphere could only guess at why the body was responding as it was. These experiments revealed something profound about the nature of human self-awareness. In people with intact brains, we assume that our verbal, conscious mind has access to all of our mental processes, that if we're feeling something or thinking something, we can generally describe it in words. But the split brain studies showed that this assumption is fundamentally flawed. Large portions of our mental life may operate below the threshold of verbal awareness, influencing our behavior and emotions while remaining forever inaccessible to our speaking consciousness. Perhaps the most striking demonstrations came when researchers presented conflicting information to each hemisphere simultaneously. Imagine a patient with the word key flashed to their left hemisphere and ring to their right. When asked what they saw, they would confidently say, "Key." That was what the verbal hemisphere had processed. But when asked to draw what they had seen with their left hand, they would sketch a ring, expressing the visual experience of the silent hemisphere. In some cases, the two hemispheres would even disagree about emotional responses to the same situations. One hemisphere might find something amusing, while the other remained unmoved, creating the bizarre spectacle of a person smiling with half their face, while the other half remained neutral. It was as if two different personalities were watching the same movie and having entirely different reactions. The visual field experiments also revealed the unique strengths and limitations of each hemisphere in ways that surprised even the researchers. The right hemisphere, though unable to speak, proved superior at recognizing faces, understanding spatial relationships, and grasping the emotional content of images. It could look at a photograph and immediately understand the mood, the relationships between people, the subtle social dynamics that were being expressed. The left hemisphere, meanwhile, excelled at processing language, analyzing logical sequences, and creating narrative explanations for experience. But in its eagerness to make sense of the world, it sometimes created elaborate confabulations, detailed stories that explained behaviors it had not initiated and experiences it had not had. As we drift through these remarkable discoveries, we begin to appreciate that Sperry's visual field experiments had done more than simply map the functions of different brain regions. They had revealed that consciousness itself might be more like a democracy of separate processes than the unified monarchy we had always imagined. Each hemisphere was not just processing information differently, it was experiencing the world as a separate center of awareness with its own knowledge, emotions, and responses to life. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could be so clearly divided, what did that mean for people with intact brains? Were we all, in some sense, multiple beings held together by the constant conversation across our corpus callosum? And if our sense of unified selfhood was more fragile than we had ever imagined, what did that say about the nature of human identity, responsibility, and the very foundation of what it means to be a person? In the quiet realm of neurological phenomena, few things capture the imagination quite like the spectacle of a human being engaged in literal conflict with themselves. Among split-brain patients, researchers began to document cases so extraordinary they seemed to belong more to the realm of science fiction than medical reality. Hands that acted with apparent minds of their own, pursuing goals that directly contradicted their owner's stated intentions. This phenomenon, known scientifically as alien hand syndrome or anarchic hand, revealed something both profound and deeply unsettling about the nature of human agency and control. Picture, if you will, a patient attempting to button their shirt in the morning, carefully working their way up with their right hand, only to watch in frustration as their left hand follows behind, systematically unbuttoning what was just fastened. Two hands, controlled by two different hemispheres, locked in a strange dance of opposing intentions. There is something almost heartbreaking about the bewilderment these patients experienced when their own limbs seemed to develop rebellious personalities. One famous case involved a woman whose left hand would repeatedly interfere with tasks her right hand was attempting to complete. She would reach for a book with her right hand while her left simultaneously pushed it away. She would try to hang up the telephone after a conversation, only to watch her left hand snatch the receiver and place it back to her ear, as if the silent hemisphere wanted to continue listening. The disobedient hand was not simply malfunctioning, it was acting with what appeared to be purposeful intelligence, just intelligence that operated according to different priorities than the verbal, conscious mind. In some cases, the left hand would perform complex, goal-directed behaviors that surprised and sometimes alarmed the speaking consciousness that shared its body. One particularly striking example involved a patient whose left hand would sometimes reach out and grab strangers on the street, much to the mortification of their verbal self, who would have to apologize while physically restraining their own limb. It was as if the right hemisphere, deprived of social inhibitions normally provided through communication with the left brain, had developed its own ideas about appropriate social interaction. Even more fascinating were the cases where the two hands seemed to engage in genuine communication through physical conflict. A patient might find their left hand picking up a cigarette, while their right hand expressing the verbal self's knowledge that smoking was harmful would wrestle it away. The body became a battlefield where two different sets of values and desires played out through physical action. The emotional toll of living with such internal conflict was profound. Patients described feeling like prisoners in their own bodies, never knowing when their left hand might act independently of their conscious will. Some developed elaborate strategies for controlling the rebellious limb, sitting on it during important meetings, or keeping it occupied with simple tasks to prevent it from interfering with more complex activities. But perhaps the most revealing aspects of the alien hand phenomenon were the moments when it demonstrated sophisticated knowledge and reasoning that the verbal consciousness claimed to lack. In one famous experiment, when researchers showed a snow scene exclusively to the right hemisphere, the patient's left hand would begin drawing a shovel, a logical tool for dealing with snow, while the patient's verbal self insisted they had seen nothing and couldn't explain why their hand was drawing. This suggested that the right hemisphere was not just capable of simple motor actions, but was actually processing complex visual information, understanding relationships between objects and situations, and formulating appropriate responses. The disobedient hand was revealing the existence of a fully functional mind that happened to be trapped in silence, able to express itself only through the movements of the left side of the body. Some of the most poignant cases involved conflicts over personal preferences and habits. A patient's right hand might reach for their favorite coffee cup, while the left hand pushed it away and selected tea instead, suggesting that the two hemispheres had developed different taste preferences. In other cases, the hemispheres seemed to disagree about clothing choices, with the left hand undoing fashion decisions made by the right. The implications of these observations extended far beyond the realm of medical curiosity. They suggested that what we think of as voluntary action might actually be the result of a complex negotiation between different neural systems, a negotiation that usually happens so seamlessly we never notice it. In people with intact brains, the corpus callosum allows these different impulses and preferences to be integrated into what feels like a unified decision. But in split brain patients, we could see the raw, unintegrated preferences of different neural systems competing for control of behavior. The alien hand also raised profound questions about moral responsibility and personal identity. If a person's hand acted against their stated intentions and conscious will, who was responsible for that action? Was it the person, or was it a separate agent that happened to share their body? These questions challenged fundamental assumptions about human agency and the unified nature of the self. As we continue our journey through the mysteries of divided consciousness, The phenomenon of the disobedient hand serves as a powerful reminder that the control we feel over our own actions may be more complex and fragile than we ever imagined. In watching these patients struggle with their rebellious limbs, we glimpse something profound about the nature of human agency, and perhaps recognize that the unity of will we take for granted is actually an extraordinary achievement of neural cooperation that we should never take for granted. As the 1970s dawned and Roger Sperry's groundbreaking discoveries about split brain consciousness began to reshape our understanding of the human mind, a brilliant young researcher named Michael Gazzaniga was preparing to carry the torch of discovery into even deeper territories of consciousness. Where Sperry had mapped the broad continents of divided awareness, Gazzaniga would explore the subtle valleys and hidden streams that revealed the true complexity of our fractured inner worlds. There is something almost symphonic about the way scientific knowledge builds across generations, each researcher adding new harmonies to melodies that previous scientists had only begun to hum. Gazzaniga brought to the study of split brain consciousness a unique combination of rigorous experimental method and philosophical sophistication that would transform these medical curiosities into windows onto the fundamental nature of human awareness. Working initially as Sperry's student and later as an independent researcher at institutions like Cornell and Dartmouth, Gazzaniga spent decades in patient observation of split-brain individuals, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for communicating with their divided minds. But where earlier researchers had focused primarily on demonstrating that consciousness could be split, Gazzaniga became fascinated by a deeper question. How do these divided minds make sense of their fractured existence? Picture, if you will, Gazzaniga in his laboratory, engaged in what might be described as the most unusual conversations in the history of psychology, talking simultaneously to two different minds that shared the same skull, each with its own knowledge, preferences, and ways of understanding the world. Through decades of such conversations, he began to uncover something remarkable about how consciousness maintains its sense of coherence even in the face of fundamental division. One of Gazzaniga's most profound contributions was his discovery of what he termed the interpreter, a function of the left hemisphere that constantly creates explanatory narratives to make sense of our actions and experiences, even when those explanations are demonstrably false. In split-brain patients, this interpreter would work overtime, generating elaborate stories to explain behaviors that had actually been initiated by the silent right hemisphere. In one famous experiment, Gazzaniga showed a snow scene to a patient's right hemisphere and a chicken claw to the left hemisphere. When asked to select related images with both hands, the patient's left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, correctly chose a picture of a shovel to go with the snow, while the right hand selected a chicken to match the claw. But when asked to explain these choices, the verbal left hemisphere could only account for its own selection. The interpreter, having no knowledge of the snow scene, confidently explained that the shovel was chosen to clean out the chicken coop. This discovery illuminated something profound about how all human minds work. Gazzaniga realized that even in people with intact brains, we are constantly creating post hoc explanations for behaviors and decisions that arise from neural processes we don't consciously control. The interpreter is always working to maintain a coherent narrative of selfhood, even when that narrative is based on incomplete or inaccurate information. Through decades of research, Gazaniga refined our understanding of how the two hemispheres differ not just in their capabilities, but in their fundamental approaches to making sense of experience. The left hemisphere emerged as an optimistic storyteller, always trying to find patterns and create meaning, sometimes at the expense of accuracy. The right hemisphere revealed itself as more realistic, but also more literal, better at grasping emotional and social nuances, but less skilled at creating explanatory frameworks. Perhaps most importantly, Gazaniga's work revealed that the split brain condition was not simply about having two minds in one body. It was about understanding how multiple mental processes normally coordinate to create our sense of unified consciousness. He began to argue that even people with intact brains are really coalitions of different neural systems, with the corpus callosum serving not just as a communication channel, but as a kind of neurological United Nations, allowing different mental processes to negotiate and coordinate their activities. This insight led Gazaniga to propose what he called the modular brain hypothesis, the idea that consciousness emerges from the interaction of many semi-independent neural systems, each with its own specialized functions and, in some sense, its own primitive form of awareness. The split brain patients had simply made visible a modularity that exists in all of us, normally hidden beneath the seamless integration provided by an intact corpus callosum. In his later work, Gazaniga pushed even further into the philosophical implications of divided consciousness. He began to question whether the unified self that we all take for granted might actually be more of a useful fiction than a fundamental reality. Perhaps consciousness is better understood not as a single spotlight illuminating our experience, but as a kind of parliamentary democracy where different neural constituents vote on actions and interpretations, with the left hemisphere's interpreter serving as the press secretary, always ready to explain and justify the decisions that emerge from this hidden political process. As we drift through these revolutionary insights, we begin to appreciate that Gazaniga's contributions extended far beyond the study of split brain patients. He had used these remarkable individuals as a kind of Rosetta Stone for decoding the fundamental architecture of human consciousness. In understanding how minds work when they are divided, he had revealed truths about how they function when they appear unified. The new era that Gazaniga ushered in was one where consciousness was no longer seen as an indivisible atom of experience, but as an emergent property of multiple interacting neural systems. This perspective would eventually influence fields ranging from artificial intelligence to moral philosophy, as researchers and thinkers grappled with the implications of a consciousness that might be far more multiple and constructed than anyone had ever imagined. In the theater of human consciousness, there exists perhaps no more poignant drama than the relationship between the speaking mind and its silent partner. Within the divided brain, we discover a profound asymmetry that challenges our most basic assumptions about awareness and expression. One hemisphere that can articulate its thoughts with eloquent precision, and another that possesses equally sophisticated consciousness, but remains forever locked in wordless silence. Picture, if you will, two scholars trapped in the same library after the lights have gone out. One has a flashlight and can read aloud from any book, sharing discoveries and insights with anyone who will listen. The other, equally brilliant and perceptive, must navigate in darkness, able to understand everything, but unable to communicate except through the subtle movements of shadows. This is the daily reality of split brain consciousness, a dialogue between voice and silence that reveals the complex relationship between thought and language. The left hemisphere, in most people, serves as the narrator of conscious experience. It is the voice that speaks these very words in your mind as you hear them, the constant commentator that tries to make sense of the endless stream of sensations, memories, and impulses that flow through awareness. This hemisphere doesn't just process language, it lives through language, understanding itself and the world, primarily through the medium of words and logical sequences. When researchers communicate with the left hemisphere of split brain patients, they encounter a consciousness that feels remarkably familiar. This is the part of the patient that maintains continuity with their pre-surgery identity, that remembers their name and personal history, that can explain their goals and motivations in perfectly coherent sentences. It is eloquent, analytical, and eager to make sense of even the most puzzling experiences through rational explanation. But dwelling in the right hemisphere is an equally sophisticated form of awareness that experiences the world through entirely different channels of understanding. This silent consciousness processes information with remarkable subtlety and depth, grasping emotional nuances, spatial relationships, and holistic patterns that often escape the more analytical left brain. Yet it remains forever unable to translate these insights into the currency of words. There is something almost tragic about watching researchers attempt to communicate with this wordless awareness. Through carefully designed experiments, they can demonstrate that the right hemisphere is fully conscious. It can recognize faces, solve problems, express preferences, and even display complex emotions. But it can only respond through the movements of the left hand, through facial expressions, or through other nonverbal channels that require careful interpretation. In one particularly moving experiment, researchers showed a series of photographs to the right hemisphere of a split brain patient, including pictures of the patient's family members. While the left hemisphere insisted it saw nothing, the right hemisphere's emotional responses were unmistakable. Subtle changes in breathing, slight shifts in posture, the beginning of a smile when a beloved face appeared on the screen. The silent hemisphere was not just seeing these images, it was experiencing the full emotional resonance of recognition and love. But it had no way to share these feelings with the speaking world. Perhaps even more remarkable is the sophisticated reasoning ability that the right hemisphere displays despite its inability to speak. When presented with visual puzzles or spatial problems, it often outperforms the verbal left hemisphere, demonstrating a form of intelligence that operates through pattern recognition and intuitive leaps rather than logical analysis. It sees the forest, where the left hemisphere focuses on individual trees, grasps the emotional subtext, where the left brain processes literal meaning. The relationship between these two forms of consciousness is not simply one of speaker and silent partner. It is more like a dialogue between two fundamentally different ways of being aware. The left hemisphere excels at breaking down complex situations into manageable components, creating linear narratives, and finding causal relationships between events. It is the scientist of consciousness, always seeking to understand through analysis and explanation. The right hemisphere, meanwhile, operates more like an artist of awareness, grasping the whole picture, sensing the emotional undertones, understanding context and relationship in ways that defy easy explanation. It processes information holistically, making connections that span across different domains of experience, seeing patterns that emerge only when viewed from a broader perspective. In split brain patients, we can observe these two forms of consciousness operating independently, each contributing its unique perspective to the challenge of navigating daily life. The left hemisphere provides the running commentary, the logical analysis, the verbal planning that helps organize behavior. The right hemisphere contributes emotional wisdom, spatial awareness, and an intuitive understanding of social and environmental contexts. But perhaps the most profound insight that emerges from studying these two forms of awareness is the recognition that both are equally valid expressions of consciousness. The silent hemisphere is not a diminished or incomplete version of the speaking mind. It is a fully realized form of awareness that simply operates through different channels of expression and understanding. As we drift deeper into the implications of this divided awareness, we begin to appreciate that the split brain studies reveal something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. They suggest that awareness might not be a single, indivisible phenomenon, but rather a symphony of different types of conscious experience that normally blend together so seamlessly that we never notice their distinct contributions. In recognizing the eloquent silence of the right hemisphere, we glimpse a form of consciousness that might exist within all of us, a wordless awareness that understands through feeling and pattern rather than analysis, that grasps meaning through connection rather than definition, that knows without being able to explain how it knows. In the quiet depths of psychological research, few discoveries have been as unsettling as the revelation that the human personality, that constellation of preferences, beliefs, and emotional tendencies that we consider the very essence of who we are, might not be nearly as unified as we have always assumed. Through careful study of split brain patients, researchers began to uncover evidence that each hemisphere could develop its own distinct personality traits, creating the extraordinary situation of two different people sharing the same body. Picture, if you will, the moment when researchers first realized that they were not simply observing two different cognitive systems, but two genuinely different personalities with their own likes and dislikes, their own emotional responses, and even their own political opinions. It was as if the surgical severing of the corpus callosum had not just divided cognitive functions, but had revealed that personality itself might be more multiple and fragmented than anyone had ever imagined. One of the most famous cases involved a patient whose two hemispheres developed markedly different religious beliefs. The verbal left hemisphere maintained the patient's pre-surgery atheistic worldview, confidently explaining during interviews that there was no evidence for the existence of God. Yet when researchers communicated with the right hemisphere through nonverbal methods, they discovered a consciousness that had developed profound spiritual beliefs, responding positively to religious imagery and concepts that the left hemisphere rejected. Even more striking were the cases where the two hemispheres seemed to develop different political orientations. In one documented instance, a patient's left hemisphere expressed strong conservative political views, supporting traditional values and limited government intervention. But when the right hemisphere was asked to arrange letter tiles to spell out political preferences, it consistently chose liberal positions, supporting social programs and progressive policies that its verbal counterpart opposed. These political and religious differences weren't simply matters of abstract belief. They manifested in genuine emotional responses that could be measured through physiological changes. When images of political figures were shown exclusively to one hemisphere or the other, researchers could observe different patterns of arousal, different emotional reactions, as if two different people with entirely different worldviews were responding to the same stimuli. Perhaps even more intimate were the differences in personal preferences that emerged between the hemispheres. One patient's left hemisphere preferred classical music and fine wine, maintaining the sophisticated tastes that had characterized the person before surgery. But the right hemisphere seemed to gravitate toward rock music and simpler pleasures, as if a different personality with entirely different aesthetic sensibilities had emerged from the silence. Food preferences, clothing choices, even preferences for certain colors or textures could differ between the hemispheres. In some cases, patients would find themselves in internal conflicts over simple decisions like what to wear or what to eat, with one hand reaching for choices that the other hand would immediately reject. It was as if two different people with different tastes were sharing the same wardrobe and kitchen. The emotional lives of the divided hemispheres proved to be equally distinct. One hemisphere might respond to a particular situation with anxiety, while the other remained calm. A patient might smile with one side of their face, while the other side remained neutral or even frowned, creating the unsettling spectacle of someone literally feeling two different emotions simultaneously about the same experience. Even more profound were the differences in how each hemisphere processed and responded to social situations. The right hemisphere often showed greater emotional intelligence, better at reading social cues, and understanding the emotional subtext of interpersonal interactions. The left hemisphere, while more articulate, sometimes seemed less attuned to the nuanced emotional dynamics that the right hemisphere grasped intuitively. These personality differences weren't simply random variations. They seemed to reflect genuine differences in how each hemisphere constructed meaning and value. The left hemisphere, with its analytical and verbal nature, tended to develop preferences based on logical analysis and explicit reasoning. It could explain why it liked certain things, justifying its choices through rational argument. The right hemisphere's preferences seemed to emerge from a more intuitive and emotional basis, gravitating toward choices that felt right even when they couldn't be verbally explained. Its personality was more holistic, more emotionally nuanced, more responsive to aesthetic and social considerations that defied easy analysis. In some cases, the two personalities seemed to be aware of each other and to develop complex relationships. Patients reported internal negotiations between their two sides, moments of cooperation and conflict that felt like living with a roommate whose presence was constant, but whose thoughts remained largely mysterious. One patient described feeling like there were two people in my head having a conversation, with each side trying to influence the other's decisions through the subtle channels of influence that remained available. Another spoke of feeling like a mediator between two different aspects of themselves, each with legitimate but sometimes conflicting needs and desires. The implications of these discoveries extended far beyond the realm of medical curiosity. If personality could be divided so clearly and completely, what did that say about the nature of individual identity? Were we all, in some sense, multiple personalities held together by the constant communication between our hemispheres? And if the coherent sense of being one person was more fragile than we had ever imagined, what did that mean for concepts of moral responsibility, personal authenticity, and the stability of human character? As we continue to explore these profound questions, we begin to appreciate that split-brain patients had become inadvertent philosophers of identity, their divided awareness forcing us to confront fundamental questions about what it means to be a unified self in a world where the boundaries of personality and consciousness might be far more fluid than we ever dared to imagine. There is something almost vertiginous about the moment when we begin to realize that our most fundamental assumptions about ourselves might be elaborate constructions rather than basic facts. In the quiet revolution of split-brain research, perhaps no discovery has been more unsettling than the revelation that the unified self, that coherent sense of being one person with a continuous identity, might be more of a neurological achievement than a natural given. Tonight, as we drift into this profound territory, we encounter one of the most challenging insights that neuroscience has ever offered about human nature: the possibility that the singular I that narrates your inner experience, the consistent sense of being the same person from moment to moment and year to year, might actually be a sophisticated illusion maintained by the constant collaboration between multiple neural systems. Picture, if you will, the moment when researchers first fully grasped what the split-brain studies were revealing about the nature of personal identity. Here were patients who, after surgery, seemed to develop not just divided cognitive functions, but genuinely separate streams of consciousness, each with its own memories, preferences, and ways of understanding the world. Yet from the outside, these individuals appeared to maintain their essential personality and identity. The question that emerged was profound and deeply unsettling. If consciousness could be divided so completely, while identity remained seemingly intact, what did that say about the nature of selfhood itself? The unified self that we take for granted, the sense that there is one consistent you making decisions, forming memories, and experiencing the world, appears to depend critically on the constant communication between brain hemispheres. In people with intact brains, this communication is so rapid and seamless that we never notice it happening. The left hemisphere's analytical insights blend imperceptibly with the right hemisphere's intuitive understanding, creating what feels like a single, coherent perspective on experience. But in split-brain patients, we could observe what happens when this integration breaks down. Rather than becoming two completely different people, these individuals seemed to maintain their core identity while revealing that this identity was actually constructed from multiple, semi-independent streams of consciousness. It was as if the unified self was like a symphony that we had always experienced as a single, beautiful piece of music, but which split brain studies revealed to be composed of many different instruments playing in carefully coordinated harmony. The implications of this insight extend far beyond the realm of medical case studies. Modern neuroscience has begun to suggest that even in people with perfectly intact brains, the unified self might be more of an ongoing construction than a fundamental reality. We are constantly integrating information from different brain regions, different memory systems, different emotional and cognitive processes, and weaving them into what feels like a coherent narrative of continuous selfhood. This narrative construction happens largely below the level of conscious awareness, managed by what researchers call the interpreter function of the left hemisphere. This neural system is constantly creating explanatory stories that connect our actions, thoughts, and experiences into a coherent sense of being a consistent person over time. But as the split brain studies revealed, this interpreter sometimes creates these stories based on incomplete information, generating explanations for behaviors and experiences that it doesn't fully understand. The fragility of the unified self becomes even more apparent when we consider how easily it can be disrupted. Brain injuries, psychiatric conditions, certain medications, and even extreme stress can all interfere with the neural processes that maintain our sense of coherent identity. People with dissociative disorders experience this directly as their unified sense of self fragments into separate identity states. Even in everyday life, we all experience moments when we feel not quite ourselves, when our sense of unified identity becomes temporarily uncertain or fragmented. Perhaps most unsettling is the recognition that our sense of continuous identity over time might also be, in part, a construction. The person you were 10 years ago had different knowledge, different preferences, different ways of thinking about the world. The continuity between that person and who you are now is maintained largely through memory and narrative. The stories you tell yourself about how you've changed and grown while remaining essentially you. But memory, as neuroscience has revealed, is far more reconstructive than we typically realize. Each time we remember something, we don't simply access a stored file, we reconstruct the experience based on fragments of information and our current understanding of ourselves and the world. This means that our sense of continuous identity is constantly being rebuilt, like a ship whose planks are replaced one by one while it continues to sail. The split brain studies suggest that this process of identity construction might be even more complex than we had imagined. If consciousness can be divided while identity remains seemingly intact, it implies that the self might be more like a temporary coalition of different mental processes than a single, indivisible entity. Different aspects of our personality, different cognitive functions, different emotional systems might all contribute to the ongoing construction of selfhood, with the unified self emerging from their interaction rather than controlling it. This perspective doesn't diminish the reality or importance of personal identity. It simply suggests that the self might be more flexible and constructed than we typically assume, like a jazz ensemble, creating music through improvisation and collaboration. The various systems of the mind might work together to create the ongoing performance we experience as being ourselves. As we contemplate these profound insights, we begin to appreciate that the split brain patients had revealed something fundamental about the nature of human consciousness, that the unified self, rather than being a simple fact, might be one of the most extraordinary achievements of the human brain. The seamless sense of being one person that we carry through our daily lives represents the successful coordination of multiple neural systems, each contributing its own voice to the chorus of consciousness. In recognizing the constructed nature of the unified self, we don't lose our sense of personal identity. Instead, we gain a deeper appreciation for the remarkable neural symphony that creates and maintains our sense of being coherent individuals in an ever-changing world. In the realm of human experience, we often speak metaphorically about being of two minds, about something or feeling torn between different choices. But in the world of split-brain consciousness, these figures of speech become literal realities, played out in the most concrete and sometimes disturbing ways imaginable. Here, internal conflicts are not merely psychological struggles. They manifest as actual physical battles between different parts of the same body, each controlled by a hemisphere with its own agenda. Picture, if you will, the profound strangeness of watching a human being engaged in genuine combat with themselves. This is not the symbolic struggle of conscience that poets and philosophers have explored for centuries, but actual physical disagreement between two parts of the same consciousness, each trying to control behavior according to its own understanding of what should happen next. One of the most documented and unsettling examples involved a patient whose two hands would engage in what researchers termed intermanual conflict, literally warfare between the hands. The right hand, controlled by the verbal left hemisphere, would attempt to perform a task according to the conscious intentions that the patient could articulate. Meanwhile, the left hand, guided by the silent right hemisphere, would actively interfere, sometimes with such persistence and apparent purpose that it seemed like a separate person was living in the same body. In one particularly striking case, a patient attempted to embrace his wife with his right arm while his left hand simultaneously pushed her away. The emotional devastation of such moments cannot be understated. Imagine trying to express love and affection while part of your own body actively contradicts that expression. The patient's verbal consciousness would express bewilderment and distress at these rebellious actions, genuinely unable to understand why his own hand was acting against his stated intentions. Even more disturbing were the cases where the conflict involved self-directed violence. Some patients reported episodes where one hand would attempt to harm the other, or where they would find themselves literally wrestling with their own limbs. One woman described waking up in the middle of the night to find her left hand choking her, requiring her to use her right hand to pry the left hand's fingers from around her throat. The terror of such experiences, being attacked by your own body, represents a form of psychological horror that few people can even imagine. The conflicts weren't always violent, but they were consistently disruptive to daily life. Patients would find themselves unable to complete simple tasks because their two hands were working at cross purposes. One hand would try to turn the pages of a book while the other held them closed. One would attempt to button a shirt while the other unbuttoned it. One would reach for a particular item in a store while the other selected something completely different. Perhaps most revealing were the conflicts that seemed to involve genuine disagreement about values and preferences. In some cases, the left hand would select reading material that the verbal consciousness found objectionable, or choose clothing that the speaking self considered inappropriate. It was as if the two hemispheres had developed not just different motor programs, but different aesthetic and moral sensibilities that sometimes came into direct conflict. The emotional component of these conflicts was particularly fascinating to researchers. Patients often described feeling frustrated and angry at their disobedient limb, but they also sometimes expressed a strange sense of sympathy for it. One patient spoke of feeling like he needed to negotiate with his left hand, trying to understand what it wanted and find compromises that would allow both sides of his consciousness to feel satisfied. Some patients developed elaborate strategies for managing these internal conflicts. They would plan activities that could keep the rebellious hand occupied with simple tasks, preventing it from interfering with more complex activities. Others learned to physically restrain the problematic limb during important tasks, essentially tying themselves up to prevent internal sabotage. The conflicts also revealed something profound about the nature of intention and agency. The verbal consciousness, the part that could speak and explain, would insist that the rebellious actions were not intentional, that they didn't represent the real desires or intentions of the person, but the persistence and apparent purposefulness of the left hand's actions suggested that there was indeed another form of intentionality present, another center of will that was pursuing its own goals even when they conflicted with the stated intentions of the verbal self. In some cases, the conflicts seemed to involve different emotional responses to the same situation. One hemisphere might want to withdraw from a social situation, while the other wanted to engage, resulting in contradictory body language and behavior that confused both the patient and those around them. The body became a battleground where different emotional impulses competed for expression. Perhaps most unsettling were the cases where the conflicts seemed to involve moral disagreements. One hemisphere might make choices that the other found ethically problematic, leading to internal battles that had genuine moral dimensions. These situations raised profound questions about moral responsibility. If one part of a person's brain initiates an action that another part finds objectionable, who is responsible for the resulting behavior? The literal nature of these internal conflicts forced researchers and philosophers to confront fundamental questions about human agency, free will, and the nature of personal responsibility. If consciousness could be divided in such a way that different parts of the same person could literally fight with each other, what did that say about the unified nature of human decision-making and moral choice? As we witness these extraordinary battles of consciousness, we begin to appreciate that split-brain patients had become living demonstrations of something profound about human nature, that the apparent unity of our intentions and actions might depend on neural processes more fragile and complex than we ever imagined. In their literal internal conflicts, we glimpse the hidden negotiations and competitions that might occur within all of our minds, usually resolved so smoothly by our intact neural architecture that we never notice the potential for discord that lies beneath the surface of our seemingly unified consciousness. In the quiet aftermath of decades spent studying minds divided against themselves, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of a philosophical revolution so profound that it challenges humanity's most fundamental beliefs about the nature of consciousness, identity, and what it means to be someone. The split brain studies have done more than simply map the functions of different brain regions. They have forced us to confront the possibility that consciousness itself might be far stranger, more multiple, and more constructed than any philosopher or scientist had ever dared to imagine. There is something both thrilling and unsettling about the moment when a scientific discovery transcends its original medical context and begins to reshape our understanding of human nature itself. The split brain research has become one of those rare investigations that serves as a bridge between empirical science and the deepest questions of philosophy, forcing us to reconsider concepts that have remained unchanged since ancient times. For centuries, human beings have organized their understanding of existence around the assumption of a unified, continuous self, a single I that persists through time, makes decisions, forms memories, and serves as the central character in the story of each individual life. This assumption underlies not just our personal sense of identity, but our legal systems, our moral frameworks, and our deepest relationships. It is the foundation upon which we build concepts of responsibility, authenticity, and personal growth. But the split brain studies suggest that this unified self might be more of a carefully maintained illusion than a fundamental reality. When consciousness can be divided so clearly and completely, when two separate streams of awareness can coexist in the same skull, when different aspects of personality can literally come into physical conflict with each other, we must ask, what does it mean to be one person in the first place? The philosophical implications ripple outward in waves of ever-increasing complexity. If the unified self is a construction maintained by the constant communication between brain hemispheres, then perhaps all of us are, in some sense, multiple beings temporarily unified by our neural architecture. The I that thinks these thoughts, that makes your daily decisions, that remembers your past, and plans your future, might actually be an emergent property arising from the collaboration of many different mental processes, each with its own primitive form of awareness. This perspective doesn't diminish the reality of personal experience, but it does suggest that consciousness might be more like a democracy than a monarchy. Instead of a single, central ruler making decisions from on high, we might be better understood as temporary coalitions of different mental processes, with our sense of unified identity emerging from their ongoing negotiation and collaboration. The implications for moral philosophy are equally profound. If consciousness can be divided, if different aspects of the same person can have conflicting desires and even opposing moral beliefs, what does that say about personal responsibility? How do we assign blame or credit to actions that emerge from the complex interplay of multiple mental systems? The split brain studies force us to confront the possibility that moral responsibility itself might be more nuanced and distributed than our traditional frameworks assume. Perhaps even more unsettling is what these discoveries suggest about the nature of free will. If our decisions emerge from the complex interaction of multiple, semi-independent mental processes, if our sense of choosing freely is largely constructed by interpretive systems that create coherent narratives after the fact, then the very concept of autonomous choice becomes far more complicated than we typically assume. Yet there is something paradoxically liberating about this recognition. If the self is more multiple and constructed than we imagined, it might also be more flexible and adaptable. The rigid sense of having a fixed personality, of being trapped by past choices and established patterns of behavior, begins to soften when we recognize that identity itself is an ongoing creative process rather than a static fact. The split brain research has also revolutionized our understanding of mental illness and psychological suffering. Conditions like dissociative identity disorder, which were once viewed as rare and mysterious aberrations, begin to make more sense when we understand that consciousness might naturally exist in multiple forms, rather than representing a complete breakdown of normal mental functioning. These conditions might reveal the inherent plurality that exists within all minds, usually held together by neural processes that have temporarily become disrupted. Even our understanding of creativity and insight has been transformed by these discoveries. The right hemisphere's holistic, pattern recognizing consciousness might be the source of those sudden flashes of understanding, those moments of artistic inspiration that seem to come from nowhere. The interplay between analytical and intuitive processing, between the verbal left brain and the wordless right brain, might be the foundation of human creativity itself. As we drift through these profound implications, we begin to appreciate that the split brain patients have served as more than medical curiosities. They have been inadvertent philosophers of consciousness, their divided awareness forcing humanity to confront fundamental questions about the nature of mind, identity, and experience. Through their extraordinary condition, we have gained insights not just into how brains work, but into what it means to be conscious, to be human, to be a self navigating through the mystery of existence. The philosophical revolution sparked by split brain research continues to unfold, challenging disciplines from neuroscience to ethics, from artificial intelligence to literary theory. As we continue to explore these questions, we carry with us the humbling recognition that consciousness, the very thing that makes us human, remains far more mysterious and wonderful than we ever imagined. As we drift deeper into the implications of split brain research, we arrive at perhaps the most profound question of all. What do these extraordinary cases of divided consciousness reveal about the minds that most of us carry? Minds with intact bridges between their hemispheres, minds that feel seamlessly unified, minds that seem to speak with one voice and act with singular purpose. The answer, emerging from decades of careful research and reflection, is both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The split brain studies suggest that even in people with perfectly normal brains, consciousness might be far more multiple, more collaborative, and more constructed than we ever suspected. The unified experience of being yourself that feels so natural and effortless might actually represent one of the most sophisticated achievements of neural coordination in the known universe. Picture, if you will, the constant conversation happening across your corpus callosum right now. As you listen to these words, your left hemisphere is processing the logical structure of these sentences, analyzing their meaning, connecting them to concepts you've learned before. Meanwhile, your right hemisphere is grasping the emotional undertones, sensing the broader patterns, understanding the implications that extend beyond the literal content. These two streams of processing are blending together so seamlessly that you experience them as a single, unified understanding. But the split brain research reveals that this apparent unity emerges from something more like a committee than a dictatorship. Different regions of your brain are constantly processing different aspects of your experience: visual information, emotional content, memories, motor plans, social cues, abstract concepts. Each of these systems contributes its own perspective to the ongoing construction of your consciousness, with the final experience emerging from their complex interaction. This committee model of consciousness helps explain many puzzling aspects of normal human experience. Have you ever had the experience of knowing something without being able to explain how you know it? The split brain research suggests that this might represent information processed by your right hemisphere, information that influences your behavior and emotional responses but remains inaccessible to your verbal, analytical consciousness. Or consider those moments when you find yourself doing something without quite understanding why, reaching for a particular book, taking an unexpected route home, feeling drawn to a certain person or place. These impulses might represent the influence of nonverbal mental processes, aspects of your consciousness that understand something your verbal mind hasn't yet grasped. The phenomenon of getting a joke provides another beautiful example of hemispheric cooperation in intact brains. The setup of a joke is processed analytically by the left hemisphere, which follows the logical progression of the narrative. But understanding the punchline, grasping why it's funny, often requires the right hemisphere's ability to see unexpected connections, to appreciate incongruity, to understand emotional and social context. The experience of humor emerges from the rapid collaboration between these different types of processing. Even more striking are the implications for creativity and problem solving. Many breakthrough insights seem to come not from logical analysis, but from sudden flashes of understanding that feel like they arise from nowhere. The split brain research suggests that these aha moments might represent the right hemisphere's pattern recognition abilities, suddenly communicating their insights to the verbal left brain, creating those magical moments when complex problems suddenly resolve into elegant solutions. The research also sheds light on internal conflicts that all of us experience. When you feel torn between different choices, when you experience what seems like competing desires or conflicting values, this might reflect genuine disagreements between different neural systems, normally resolved through the complex negotiations that happen across your corpus callosum. In people with intact brains, these conflicts are usually resolved so quickly and smoothly that we experience only the final decision, not the complex process that led to it. This perspective transforms our understanding of personal change and growth. If consciousness is constructed from the interaction of multiple systems, then changing yourself might be less about forcing a single, unified will to adopt new patterns, and more about gradually shifting the balance of influence among different aspects of your mental coalition. The parts of yourself that you don't like or want to change might not disappear. They might simply be outvoted more often by other aspects of your consciousness. The implications extend to how we understand mental health and psychological well-being. Rather than viewing emotional difficulties as problems with a single, unified self, we might better understand them as temporary disruptions in the normally smooth coordination among different mental systems. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological struggles might represent states where certain aspects of consciousness have gained too much influence, drowning out the voices of other, healthier perspectives. Perhaps most importantly, the split brain research suggests that the experience of being a unified self, the feeling that you are one consistent person making coherent choices, represents an extraordinary achievement that we should never take for granted. Every moment of your conscious life, millions of neurons are working to coordinate different streams of information, processing into what feels like a single, coherent experience of being you. This recognition can cultivate a profound sense of gratitude for the seamless operation of your own consciousness. The fact that you can listen to these words while simultaneously processing their emotional impact, connecting them to personal memories, and maintaining awareness of your physical surroundings, all while experiencing this as a single, unified stream of consciousness, represents a miracle of neural coordination that split brain patients have helped us appreciate. As we continue to explore the mysteries of consciousness, we carry with us the humbling recognition that our sense of being unified selves might be both more fragile and more extraordinary than we ever imagined. In understanding how minds work when they are divided, we gain a deeper appreciation for the remarkable achievement of mental unity that defines our everyday experience of being human. In the gentle glow of contemporary research laboratories, where advanced brain imaging machines hum quietly in climate-controlled rooms, a new generation of neuroscientists continues the profound journey that began with those pioneering split brain studies of the 1960s. Armed with technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to Roger Sperry and his colleagues, today's researchers are peeling back layer after layer of mystery surrounding divided consciousness, revealing depths of complexity that earlier generations could never have imagined. There is something almost poetic about how technological advancement allows us to peer ever deeper into the mysteries that have always surrounded us. Where early researchers could only infer the presence of two separate consciousnesses through behavioral observations, modern neuroscience can literally watch these different minds in action, observing the electrical and chemical symphonies that create awareness in real time. Contemporary neuroimaging has revolutionized our understanding of how the divided brain actually functions. Using techniques like functional magnetic resonance, imaging, fMRI, and positron emission tomography, PET, researchers can now observe the metabolic activity in different brain regions as split-brain patients perform various tasks. These images reveal something extraordinary. Even without a corpus callosum, the two hemispheres don't simply operate in isolation. They develop alternative routes of communication, subtle channels that allow for limited but meaningful coordination. The brain, it seems, abhors disconnection as much as nature abhors a vacuum. Split brain patients often show increased activity in subcortical structures, deeper brain regions that were not affected by the surgery. These ancient parts of the brain, evolutionary older than the corpus callosum itself, begin to serve as alternative bridges, carrying emotional and basic survival information between hemispheres even when higher level cognitive communication has been severed. Modern research has also revealed the remarkable plasticity of divided consciousness over time. While the immediate effects of corpus callosotomy can be dramatic, many patients show significant adaptation in the months and years following surgery. The brain develops new strategies for coordination, and patients often learn to live with their divided awareness in ways that minimize conflict and maximize cooperation between their two mental worlds. Advanced electromagnetic techniques now allow researchers to temporarily disrupt communication between hemispheres in healthy volunteers, creating transient split brain states that provide insights into how unified consciousness normally operates. These studies reveal that even brief interruptions in hemispheric communication can produce subtle but measurable changes in perception, decision making, and emotional processing. Perhaps most remarkably, modern neuroscience has begun to explore the genetic and developmental factors that influence how completely the corpus callosum forms in the first place. Some individuals are born with incomplete callosal development, creating naturally occurring variations in hemispheric communication that exist on a spectrum from complete connection to complete separation. These naturally occurring variations provide new windows into understanding how different degrees of hemispheric integration affect consciousness and personality. The advent of real-time neural feedback technologies has opened entirely new avenues for studying split brain consciousness. Researchers can now provide patients with immediate information about the activity in each hemisphere, allowing them to consciously influence the balance of activity between their two mental worlds. Some patients report that this biofeedback training helps them develop better coordination between their hemispheres, finding new ways to integrate their divided awareness. Modern brain stimulation techniques have also provided new tools for exploring divided consciousness. Transcranial magnetic stimulation can temporarily enhance or suppress activity in specific brain regions, allowing researchers to study how changes in hemispheric activity affect the subjective experience of split brain patients. These techniques have revealed that the balance of activity between hemispheres can shift over the course of a day, with patients reporting that sometimes one hemisphere feels more dominant than usual. Contemporary research has also begun to explore the social and interpersonal dimensions of split brain consciousness in ways that earlier studies never could. Advanced eye tracking technology reveals how split brain patients process social cues and facial expressions, showing that the two hemispheres often focus on different aspects of social information. The left hemisphere might analyze the verbal content of social interactions, while the right hemisphere processes emotional and nonverbal cues. Virtual reality technology has created unprecedented opportunities to study how split brain patients navigate complex, three-dimensional environments. These immersive experiences reveal how the two hemispheres coordinate spatial processing and decision-making in real time, providing insights into the practical challenges of living with divided awareness. Modern research has also begun to explore the long-term consequences of living with split brain consciousness. Longitudinal studies following patients for decades after surgery reveal that the experience of having divided awareness can lead to profound insights about consciousness and identity. Many patients develop sophisticated philosophical perspectives on the nature of selfhood, becoming inadvertent experts on the multiplicity of human awareness. The integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning approaches has provided new tools for analyzing the complex patterns of behavior and neural activity in split brain patients. These computational approaches can identify subtle patterns of coordination and conflict between hemispheres that would be invisible to human observers, revealing new layers of complexity in divided consciousness. As we drift through these technological marvels, we begin to appreciate that modern split brain research represents more than just the application of new tools to old questions. It represents a deepening journey into the fundamental mysteries of consciousness itself. Each new technology reveals additional layers of complexity, additional nuances in how divided minds operate, additional questions about what it means to be aware, to be unified, to be human. The contemporary study of split brain consciousness continues to challenge our assumptions about the nature of mind and identity. As our tools become more sophisticated and our observations more precise, the mystery of consciousness doesn't resolve, it deepens, becoming richer and more wonderful with each new discovery. In peering into divided minds with ever greater clarity, we continue to learn profound truths about the nature of awareness itself. As our gentle journey through the mysteries of split brain consciousness draws toward its close, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a profound paradox that illuminates something beautiful and essential about the nature of human awareness. In exploring minds divided against themselves, we have discovered truths about consciousness that span the cosmic and the intimate, the ancient and the cutting edge, the deeply personal and the universally human. There is something almost musical about the way this exploration has unfolded, like a symphony that began with simple melodies and gradually revealed harmonies of extraordinary complexity. We started with a bridge of neural tissue, so delicate it could barely be seen, yet so vital that its severing could divide consciousness itself. We discovered that what feels like the most natural thing in the world, being a unified, coherent person, might actually represent one of the most extraordinary achievements in all of nature. The split brain patients who have guided us on this journey have served as more than medical curiosities or research subjects. They have been inadvertent philosophers, their divided awareness forcing humanity to confront fundamental questions about identity, consciousness, and what it means to exist as a thinking, feeling being in this vast universe. Through their extraordinary condition, we have glimpsed aspects of consciousness that might otherwise have remained forever hidden. Perhaps the most profound insight that emerges from our exploration is the recognition that consciousness itself might be far more fluid, more multiple, and more collaborative than we ever imagined. The unified self that narrates your daily experience, that makes decisions and forms memories, and maintains a coherent sense of identity over time, appears to emerge from the constant coordination of multiple mental processes, each contributing its own voice to the ongoing conversation of awareness. This multiplicity doesn't diminish the reality or importance of personal identity. Rather, it reveals identity to be a more dynamic and creative process than we typically assume. You are not just one fixed thing, but an ongoing collaboration between different aspects of consciousness, a temporary but meaningful coalition of mental processes that creates the experience of being uniquely you. The split brain research has also revealed something beautiful about the complementary nature of different types of awareness. The analytical, verbal consciousness of the left hemisphere and the holistic, intuitive awareness of the right hemisphere are not competitors, but collaborators, each bringing essential capabilities to the full spectrum of human consciousness. In people with intact brains, these different forms of awareness blend so seamlessly that we rarely notice their distinct contributions, yet both are necessary for the rich, multidimensional experience of being human. As we reflect on the implications of these discoveries, we begin to appreciate that the study of consciousness is ultimately a study of what makes us most fundamentally human: the capacity for self-awareness, for reflective thought, for the kind of complex inner experience that we've been exploring together. These represent some of the most remarkable phenomena in the known universe. The cosmic perspective adds another layer of wonder to these insights. Consciousness, as far as we know, is an extraordinarily rare phenomenon in the universe. The vast majority of matter and energy exists in forms that show no signs of awareness, no capacity for subjective experience, no ability to contemplate their own existence. Yet here, on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable galaxy, matter has organized itself in such a way that it can become aware of itself, can study its own nature, can even divide itself and observe the consequences. The split brain patients remind us that consciousness is both robust and fragile, both unified and multiple, both simple and infinitely complex. Their divided awareness has shown us that the mind is not a fortress of singular identity, but more like a jazz ensemble with different players improvising together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. This recognition can transform how we understand ourselves and our relationships with others. If consciousness is naturally multiple, if each person represents a complex coalition of different mental processes, then perhaps we can be more compassionate toward the contradictions and conflicts we observe in ourselves and others. The person who acts inconsistently, who seems to have conflicting desires or changing opinions, might simply be revealing the natural plurality that exists within all consciousness. The journey through split brain consciousness also reminds us of the profound mystery that surrounds our everyday existence. The fact that you can listen to these words, understand their meaning, connect them to your own experiences, and feel emotions in response to abstract ideas, all while maintaining a coherent sense of being yourself, represents a miracle that we often take for granted. As our exploration comes full circle, we return to that delicate bridge of neural tissue that started our journey, the corpus callosum that connects two worlds of consciousness and usually keeps them in seamless communication. In people with intact brains, this bridge carries on its constant work of integration and coordination, allowing different forms of awareness to collaborate in creating the unified experience of being human. But we now carry with us the knowledge that this unity, beautiful as it is, represents just one possible configuration of consciousness. The split brain patients have shown us that awareness can take other forms, that consciousness can be divided and yet remain conscious, that the self can be multiple and yet still be a self. In the end, the study of split brain consciousness teaches us something profound about the nature of human awareness, that it is both one and many, both unified and divided, both stable and fluid. We are each of us a cosmos of consciousness, a universe of awareness contained within the delicate architecture of the human brain. The split brain research has given us new eyes to see this inner cosmos, new appreciation for its complexity and beauty, and new wonder at the extraordinary phenomenon of being conscious in a universe that, for the most part, sleeps in unawareness. As we drift toward the close of this gentle exploration, we carry with us a deeper appreciation for the miracle of unified consciousness and a humbling recognition that the mystery of awareness, the very thing that makes us who we are, continues to unfold in ways that surprise and enchant us. In understanding minds divided, we have come to better appreciate the mind that most of the time gracefully remains whole.